Chief Monahan, welcome to Recalibrate Reality. I appreciate you joining us.
Absolutely, Scott. It's my pleasure.
So you've been on the NYPD. You were on there for 39 years. First, thank you for your service and for doing that, and for your continued service in your current role. But I would love to start by just getting some of your insights of what it means to be part of the NYPD, to be a cop, and someone. People think of the NYPD as the largest police force, most sophisticated police force in the country. Just so get some of your specific insights, and then maybe even carry that to what you're doing today, if you don't mind.
Listen, 39 are the best years of my life. I couldn't have wanted to do anything better. I came from a family of police officers, starting from my grandfather back in 1927. It's something that's in your blood. It's something that you've always wanted to do. I joined with a whole bunch of friends right out of high school. It's the greatest profession in the world. You spend your life helping other people, going out there, serving people, keeping people safe, getting what are some very bad people off the streets too, which is necessary. It's a tough job, but it's the most rewarding job in the world. You see someone in distress, you help them, you help save their day, make their day. There's nothing better. And the camaraderie, the people that you work with, friends that you meet from day one, they're your friends forever. It is probably the greatest, most noble profession in the world. I couldn't have spent 39 better years of my life. I love this city, born and raised in the Bronx. You can tell by my accent, but moving into the new role, it's the same thing. It's how do we keep New York City? How do we get New York City back to where it was pre-pandemic? It's a great challenge, something I'm looking forward to helping do. Make sure people feel safe coming back into the city. I want to see the streets filled. That's what my new role is. I want to see Times Square bustling with people where, you have to squeeze through the crowds, but that's New York. It's where I grew up. It's what I love. And that's what I'm hoping to see.
Could you just give a little bit about your new role so everyone has a sense in terms of what you're doing now for the city and public safety?
All right. So my role now is to work together with every city agency to see what businesses need to come back, what people need to feel safe coming back into the city. People need to feel comfortable. What do we do in our subway systems? That is the lifeblood of the city. If we want people in their office buildings, we want people visiting New York, they have to feel safe on that subway. It's working together with our transit authority, working together with the MTA, working with homeless services to see what we can do, what new initiatives we could try to make people feel safe. There's crime, there's realities of crime in the city, we all know, but then there's perceptions. And I can tell you crime is down. I can give you a whole bunch of statistics. It doesn't matter if people don't feel safe coming back into the workplace, coming back to a show on Broadway. So that's what we're working to do. That's my role, is to try and handle these perceptions, handle the realities, and get everybody on the same page. Working together, I deal with everyone, 76 BIDs, business improvement districts in the city. I'm working with each and every one of them to make sure that whatever their issues are in their particular neighborhoods throughout this great city, that it's being handled.
Yeah, that's great. And it's interesting when you were talking about the family, because I know a lot of NYPD officers that have family lineage, and the whole NYPD is like a big family. And even as you're describing New York and the sense of community and the vibrancy of what New York is a big family, right? And I think we've had a tough year. The NYPD obviously had a tough year dealing with COVID directly, having to deal with some of the challenges that we faced, in terms of what was happening on our streets. Take a second and describe sort of your take. 39 years. How's this year stack up? You've seen a lot between 9/11, a lot of different things. How's this year, in terms of on a comparison basis as to what that was?
This was probably the toughest year I've ever spent in law enforcement. It was, from the start with COVID, an unseen enemy. 55 members of the NYPD lost their lives to COVID-10 uniform, 38 civilian, I think another 7 auxiliary police officers. At one point, 20% of our police force was out sick during the height of COVID. I mean, that is something that has never happened before. I think it was over 11,000 of our members tested positive for COVID at one point. But unlike businesses throughout the country, we don't close up shop. We're out there each and every day, the NYPD, doing what you have to do. It's just another way that cops were putting their lives on the line. And then it rolled right into George Floyd. The protests, the riots that occurred shortly thereafter, and then the peaceful protests after that, the looting that happened, and just all the reforms and the basically attacking police officers throughout the city based on the actions of an individual in Minneapolis. 800,000 law enforcement officers around this country paying the price for the actions of one police officer in Minneapolis that day. Obviously, as a police department, you're always ready for reform and you're always looking to see how you can reform. But sometimes certain things could get rushed down your throat in the trying to fit into the political sphere of making change as quickly as possible.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting because you think about, you mentioned the George Floyd killing, and we as a country and frankly the world watched that live and reeled in pain on that, and it evoked emotions that I'm sure a lot of you and your colleagues felt the same way all of us felt, right? To your point about that then it resulted in people looking at police and the NYPD differently than it would have otherwise been before. How do you think about when you've seen things like this? You have within the NYPD, where there has been in the past, there are bad apples, right? And just like you mentioned, in Minneapolis, there's a bad apple. Do you think in the past that the force has been good enough at identifying where those bad apples are and removing them effectively?
It's something that really never comes out is how many police officers every year get fired from this agency. And it's quite a lot. Over 100 police officers a year are fired from the NYPD for various actions. Nothing is worse for an agency, for a good cop that's out there every single day doing his job, to get someone that's violent for no reason, stealing, anything tarnishing the badge. It ruins all of our reputation. It ruins the hard work that the men and women do every single day out on the street. So I saw that shaving in Minneapolis, and it disgusted me that day.
Yeah.
And well, it was a universal response. I mean, Patty Lynch and the union stood out and said, this is something that we can never condone, that we find reprehensible. It's not often that you hear everyone in unison condemning that act. It's not what police work is about. It's not what we do. It's not what 800,000 police officers that go through millions of jobs a day. It's not something that they want to do. Are there bad apples? Absolutely. It's up to us to identify them, to remove them from this job so they don't tarnish the reputation of law enforcement all over this country.
Listen, and being a police officer in action's got to be one of the most intense jobs out there, because you got to, react quickly, and you got to try to deal with the situation, assess the situation, but also try to diffuse the situation. And one of the things that stood out to me in June during the protest, there was the videos of you in a situation that felt like it was getting out of control, and you were able to work with the crowd and diffuse it and create from what could have been a really horrific moment, a moment of unity. Could you walk through sort of what that experience was like and how you were able to diffuse that?
Yeah, that was, listen, it'd been through a couple of tough nights where whenever we tried to talk to the crowds, they weren't responding. They were attacking us. Police officers were getting attacked for days. 5,000 people coming out of Washington Square Park. It became a little tense. We were able to move some cops back. It diffused it a little bit. Crowd started pushing up against the police officers again. Some bottles started getting thrown. It was at that point, it was the first time during the course of those riots that there was some leaders of the protest that were trying to hold the crowds back. And they started talking to the crowds. It wasn't getting anywhere. They turned to me for help. It was just a natural thing to do. I walked into the crowd. I gave a speech talking about, listen, there are people to protest, every right to be out on the street and protest. We encourage it. Don't allow a few troublemakers who are looking to cause violence ruin a protest. That we're all in this together. This is New York City. We don't want to see things burning. We don't want to see stores destroyed. We don't want to see people hurt on the streets. We all have to live together. These are our neighborhoods. At that point, I joined with him and I got down on a knee. And in unity, we went down. And at that point, what was a volatile situation, it ended. And they marched off peacefully. Obviously, there was incidents over the next couple of nights, but that crowd wasn't a crowd that wanted violence. That crowd was looking to protest, and they were able to get rid of the troublemakers that were looking to turn it into a violent march.
Yeah, it was really remarkable, and I commend you. And I remember when I saw it, it gave me a whole different sense of unity, and that we're going to get through this together. And I think that you need those types of moments, and it was extraordinary. You mentioned that there were some people there that were more like troublemakers, and that was one of the things that, as I watched things unfold, and I'm curious if this is how it developed. Were there peaceful protesters, and then there were groups that came in that were more there to create trouble, to do the looting, that were sort of just in and out of the city? Because it just felt like there were two different factions, coming through.
There were various different protests. Listen, protests throughout the city. What we saw, anytime that there was someone organizing a protest, whether it was Reverend McCall, whether it was Kirsten Foy, whether it was Al Sharpton, if there was an organizer, it wasn't a problem. But when there was no leadership, when it was something that was just posted on social media, show up here, with no leadership, people who were looking to cause an issue were able to do it. You'd hear black bloc, and you hear that all the time. The second that individuals in the crowd started covering up head to toe in black, you knew that trouble was going to happen. Things were going to get broken. And that's, quite often as the sun went down, that's what we were facing. So there were incidences of crowds that were looking for nothing but destruction and not disruption. Disruption is fine, destruction is not. And others, when there was leadership, there were no issues whatsoever. You can get 10,000, 20,000 walking over a bridge. With leadership, it's a can of corn, no problem at all. But when you have people running around looking to cause violence, that was the issue. And that happened when the looting started. Large crowds, especially down in Soho, starting fires. And as the fires were burning, fire department would come, they'd run down the block, start breaking the windows of stores. Eventually, when all windows were broken, someone was going in to start stealing. It was crimes of opportunity at that point. The word got out, stores are open, and it really went crazy for 2 days. Lost in that is we made over 550 arrests for burglaries. Those were cops grabbing people inside stores that were looting them. And that wasn't even a quarter of the individuals who were breaking into stores over the course of those 2 nights.
And just looking back on it, do you think that the NYPD was prepared enough in the beginning, had enough cops on the street in the beginning, had enough intelligence? I mean, there's now sort of on 2020 hindsight, would you do anything different?
It's a tough question. I thought about that all the time. I was out every single incident. I was all over the place for those 2 days. I think I slept for around 5 hours over the course of a week.
Right.
But, in the beginning, never expected what we saw. Never expected what we saw at the Barclays Center on that Friday night. Thousands upon thousands of people coming. We didn't have the cops there that we needed to try and control it. But I don't know how many cops I could have put there to control it. There was literally 5,000 to 10,000 people there, and bottles and rocks were getting thrown. It was a dangerous situation. I would have liked better intel. I don't know if we could have gotten better intel. I don't know if anyone could have expected that. It was an idea of so many people, I think, cooped up over COVID. The George Floyd, probably a lot too. The NYPD doing so much COVID enforcement. Enforcement on mask wearing, enforcement keeping people from going out. It hurt the relationship that cops had with their communities when all of a sudden you're telling people, get off the streets. You can't hang out in a group of 3. It wasn't a great thing. So there was a lot of animosity built up towards policing going into George Floyd. And I think everything just exploded at once. I would love to say I could have done things differently. We could have done things differently. More cops, or maybe there's more negative interactions, less cops. There may have been more burning, more damage. It's hard to say what would have happened. And I don't know if we'll ever find another time in history where everything collided at that one point.
You bring up this point about the COVID enforcement, and as you were talking earlier about the focus on being there for the community and how different this time is. It made me think about when COVID hit. The natural reaction normally for New Yorkers is to go be there with people, to help, to come together and help, and that's like we did post 9/11, Superstorm Sandy. We came together, and in this instance, your job was to keep people apart. And to your point, which I really hasn't resonated with me until you said it, which is that actually not only puts you in a bad perception of the people that you're have to keep apart, but also their perception of you and being able to build bonds, the NYPD, with people in the community, because you can't engage with them as you normally would engage with them.
Exactly. Listen, after 2014, Ferguson and Garner, we came up with neighborhood policing, which was connecting the cops with the community, having them out off the radio, spending time with people. So you're not just responding to 911 calls, going to gatherings, getting to know people in the neighborhood. And all of a sudden, here comes COVID. And those same people that we would go and talk to on the corner, we're chasing off the corner, telling them you can't gather here. People are going into a restaurant. We're walking into the restaurant saying you can't be in here. You're violating this rule. In hindsight, I don't know if that should have been the NYPD's role. There was a lot of pressures being put on anytime there was a gathering. Why isn't the NYPD addressing it? Why aren't they being more forceful? This is a health crisis. I understand that, but you have to weigh everything going back and forth. So I look at that as just the negative experience and how they remember the police based on that. And walking into Floyd, I think it just, it really caused a lot of the issues that we faced.
Yeah, I think as we leave the worst of the pandemic and start with this new normal, reinstating and rebuilding those bonds and those relationships everywhere, whether, NYPD on the streets, in the communities, with business, within organizations, is going to be something that's going to have to be an intentional effort. I think people have to start by recognizing that they've been diluted or harmed during this period of time. So it's going to be important. One policy that's been kicked around that ties to what we were just talking about, I'm curious on your view on, which is a question as to whether NYPD members need to live in New York City. And I know that's been something that's kicked around. What's your feeling about that?
I was a Bronx guy, grew up in the Bronx. I just started as a cop in the Bronx. Eventually, I bought a house. I moved upstate. It was just nice to have something that I never had growing up. As I advanced in my career, as I got older. So to say that you're locked into living in the city forever, you have to have some options. You're close to the city. You can be there. I don't think it makes you a different person because you decided to do something for your family, to move somewhere else. As much as I love this city, it's great to sometimes get out of the city. So It's also expensive. You want a house with a yard in New York City. I don't think you're doing it on a New York City police officer's salary.
Right.
And that's something that everyone's always striving for, pushing for. So I wouldn't want to take the dream away from someone who's looking to do something, advance in their lives.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with you. It feels like this is one of the policies that sounds good on paper, but when you try to put it into practice, it would limit the number of potential candidates that we have. And the reality is, good police officers spend their days bonding with the communities in which they're working, right? That's the objective there.
Exactly. Listen, you don't work in the neighborhood that you live in, even if you are in the city. You have to go to another neighborhood. Obviously, you don't want to be a cop in uniform and then, arrest somebody and all of a sudden he's your next door neighbor. So we always put cops in neighborhoods away from the communities that they live. So I don't think it would make that much of a difference. And when we look we did a study on stats, civilian complaints. Do cops who live in New York City get more? It turned out cops that lived outside New York City had less civilian complaints than the cops who lived inside New York City. So a lot of study would have to go into it. I don't think it's something that is appropriate at this time.
Yeah, no, but I think as we've leave COVID, I think we have to be careful what policies we start shifting to, and I think it's like everything I've seen as we're coming back to this new normal, whether it's returning to the workplace, returning opening restaurants, there's going to be a period of adjustment, right, where everyone's got to regroup again. There's some pent up demand, re-engaging with people, and then it takes time to then take the step back and start. How would you recalibrate for the longer term, right? But I think you got to be careful in those early decisions. I want to move a little bit away from where we were with this past year, but also just you mentioned perception of crime, right? And I think that's been one of the issues, and I speak to a lot of people who still haven't returned to the city, and they say to me, is the city safe? Can I can't wait to be able to get to the city and walk on in my neighborhood again. And I'm like, the city's safe. I walk in the city all the time. I take the subway. But when you look at, some of the stats, right, while it's not back to 1980s or 1990s, there's an increase in homicides, there's increases in shootings, but those are the things that people are pointing to. When you think about, where we are, in terms of how would you describe why this isn't, we're not returning to the bad old days, and this is just, certain stats that people are focused on, that's amplifying or maybe creating a perception that there's an issue.
All right, we'll start with shootings and homicides first. If you listen, what happened it was right after George Floyd. It went crazy. There was a lot of shootings. Homicides went up over 1,500 shootings last year. I think 400, just under 500 homicides. Numbers we haven't seen, but if you look, it's numbers we haven't seen since 2011. We're not going back to where we were in the 90s when there was 2,200 homicides and over 5,000 shootings. So we're nowhere near that, or are we ever going to get there, for the simple reason so many changes have taken place since the early 90s to now. I mentioned CompStat earlier. CompStat is never going to allow that to happen. I could tell you, as a young captain in 92, when someone got shot, no one really cared. There really wasn't a big push to do something about it. Detectives would go out, he'd grab the case. If he could solve it, he could solve it. If he didn't, move on to the next one. Now, a shooting happens, you're seeing captains show up on the scene, detective captains, detective chiefs showing up on the scene. It's going to be brought up at CompStat. You're questioned on everything, on how you're responding to that case. Where are the leads? What are the cameras? Cameras, you can't go 15 feet in the city without a camera picking you up somewhere. We've gotten very good at tracing people back from before the incident to after the incident. There are so many technological advances that we've made since the early 90s, and there's so much accountability, and that's so important. If you're getting shot up in your precinct and you don't know what's going on and you don't have some sort of answer to try and fix it, you're not going to be a commanding officer there for very long. So it's bad. I could tell you this year, looking at it, though the numbers show it's up. If you look at the rate we are going into the summer, I'm looking at a year that will probably be a little bit less than last year. Still way too much. It's double from the great years we had. It was unheard of when we went into 2017, 2018 with under 800 shootings.
Right.
I remember when I first came down to headquarters with Bill Bratton, he was just trying, if we could ever get under 1,000, it would be great. He never got under 1,200 during his time. When Jimmy O'Neill was his first year, we hit 998 at the end of the year. It was like, I remember standing in Times Square talking to Dermot Shea, who was the crime control guy, cheering that we made it under 1,000 as the ball came down. So for us, it's always a push. We want to get those numbers down. It'll be a challenge, but I'm sure we're going to get it in the right direction. Listen, you got to mention bail reform. It is obviously something that's caused a lot of issues. And then you take the courts being closed for COVID. Cases will move forward, and they'll say cases moving forward, but with bail reform, you're getting out. So you get a gun, it's the least restrictive bail. You make that gun arrest, and we're making more gun arrests now than we've had since 1995. He's right back out on the street because it needs the least restrictive bail. Once you're out on the street, it is no longer a priority of the court system to move that case along. You're out, they want to move with the limited court space, you want to move along the cases where someone's actually sitting in jail. So those cases just drag on and on and on. So there's no consequence. You're not seeing the consequence for that action, which is why we're seeing individuals with multiple gun arrests, indicted on multiple cases, back out on the street doing acts of violence. So that builds upon it. Last summer, in light of Floyd, there was a decision to get rid of the anti-crime units. And we didn't have a real answer for what to do once we got rid of them. So there was a void during the summer, and the people who were looking to cause harm out on the streets took advantage of it. And there was a spike in shootings during the summer, which we hadn't seen, and we didn't have much of an answer. By the end of the summer, we came up with uniformed public safety officers whose goal was, again, to look for people with guns out on the streets, but they'd be wearing a uniform, so they wouldn't be running around in plain clothes.
So it was the anti-crime unit basically the same as the uniform police that are out there now? Just maybe give a little background, and also maybe share why was it something that was dismantled?
All right, so the anti-crime unit was a plainclothes unit in unmarked cars that were driving around. Again, they would come out, they would confront people. There may have been a feeling, hesitancy to think that they were really cops because they weren't dressed up in uniform. There had been quite a few incidences where people pulled guns, and there were shootouts involving the anti-crime cops and individuals, which, as going through Floyd, a decision was made that it wouldn't benefit us for one of these anti-crime units to get involved in a shooting and cause possible frictions. So as they move forward, by putting them back in uniform, they were still able to do the same type of work. And now when they jump out of that car, there's no doubt who they are. You're not taking that second thought. It wasn't someone on the street thinking that he was about to be jumped by another gang member. They realized it was an NYPD cop that was going. So there was a less frequency for them to pull a gun. And we're hoping to see, and have seen, less incidences of gunplay between our public safety officers and the bad guys on the street.
So is this an example, like when on getting rid of the anti-crime unit, is it an example of throwing out a policy versus reforming it? And if you reformed it and just from the beginning had police officers that were wearing uniforms, we could have been where we are today and probably avoided a much more crime and this increase that we've seen in gun violence.
Yeah, it should have been reformed. There should have been some more thought put into it before we did it. But listen, you were talking about a time where everyone wanted every sort of reform. There was a fear that a district attorney would be looking at the actions of one of these cops, and they'd be trying to do something right and could get themselves in trouble, get themselves arrested. So a decision was made to remove them while we thought about how to reform them. So it did cause a void during the summer, and you heard it whenever we locked people up on the street. Their line, you'd interview them afterwards, and their line was, why are there more guns on the street? Well, the D's are gone. They'd call the plainclothes guys the D's for detectives out on the streets. So there was a void that is now at least being filled by the public safety officers.
And similar to bail reform, right? There's an issue again where there are root issues with how the bail was used, who got bail, who didn't get bail, who could afford bail. In terms of the reform that was put in place, do you think that again was a situation that went too far in a direction, and if you could modify it, what modifications would you make to make it something that it gets to the root issue?
We completely agree. There's no one should be held in jail because they don't have $500 to pay a bail. But a judge needs to have some discretion. Without that judge's discretion, people get out right away. It happened the other day with the synagogue, guy breaking into synagogues, burglarizing synagogues, hate crime. One judge decides to try and word the law a certain way and gives bail on appeal. Second judge says no, it doesn't fit the circumstances. He's put right back out on the street. If a person's going to court right now, he may have 3 open gun cases or robbery. As long as he's been going to court, that judge has to give him the least restrictive bail, even on a crime that is bail eligible. because it doesn't matter if he's dangerous. It only matters that he's shown up for his court cases. And once he's out, there's no urgency to move that court case along. So it's a catch-22 that at least give that judge that option to say, this individual, he's a menace to society. He's a danger to the people out in his community. He should stay in. That's all we've ever asked. We're not looking to keep someone in jail because they stole diapers out of a Dwayne Reed for their kids.
It sounds like it went the opposite way, right? If they're able to, if they don't get on bail, then there's no, impetus or rush to actually process them and give them due process. So they stay on the streets longer. And if it is someone that should be behind bars, then the public safety is at risk longer.
Right. I mean, we had an incident not that long ago. An individual indicted for 2 separate robberies had already pled guilty with sentence pending on 2 gun charges. And he gets picked up out on the street with another gun and let right back out. Luckily, because it hit the news media, a week later, he had a court appearance. And at that point, he was remanded under 2 cases where he was already sentenced. So there's no urgency to put someone into the system right now, no matter how dangerous they are.
Earlier you mentioned the role of the NYPD as even related to COVID enforcement. And then there's questions relative to things like dealing with homelessness. And we recently had Christine Quinn on, who leads the largest supportive housing program for women and families. And she talked about the different, mental health services that have been lacking, and which results in a homeless population with people who, have, mental illness, right? And many times, you see them on the street and you see the NYPD are called. And obviously we don't want to criminalize people with mental illness, but how do you deal with that as the NYPD, and should it be the NYPD dealing with those circumstances?
The NYPD has to be in a support role. The lead agencies has to be DHS, Department of Homeless Services, and DOHMH. They're the ones who have the responsibility for it. They have to be held accountable to this. It's part of the reclaiming, I'd say, of Midtown that we're doing right now, is having DHS commit a lot of resources, especially around the Penn Station area, have DOHMH put their resources in the Midtown area, because that's one of the largest complaints I've been getting from the different business districts in Midtown, is that there are people who are in mental crisis walking on the streets, talking to themselves, yelling at people, or someone has to interact with them.
Right.
The streets are not full like they used to. As they start to get full, we want them to see different city agencies interacting with the things that they believe are a problem. Being homeless isn't a crime, but it's also, someone shouldn't have to sleep on the street. Someone shouldn't have to sleep on a subway. There should be some sort of resource that we could use. Obviously, some of it is some crime activity. People shooting up. We keep hearing stories of that the police have to be involved in. And they may have to go with DHS as a joint effort to make sure that, the last thing I want is a DHS employee to get assaulted. So if they have an issue, they need uncomfortable going into an area, we'll be there and we'll lend them all the support that they need. This is how we're going to clean the city up. This is how we're going to make people feel comfortable. And this is how New York is going to come back.
Yeah, Christine would say we can't be focused on just managing the problem. We got to try to solve it. And without the social services and the support and a place for people to go for that support, we're not solving it. Just as you said, moving them from the below ground to above ground, or to one location to the other location, that doesn't solve the problem.
Exactly. So there has to be a solution. Is it going to be an easy one? No. But, part of the Midtown issue, again, the hotels. We put a lot of homeless in hotels here for COVID. Well, with the restrictions easing, at this point, hopefully we can start getting the shelter system capacity up. We can get a lot of these individuals vaccinated, so we can get the hotels in the Times Square area back to being what they were for, tourists, and get the tourists back into New York City. So this is all plans moving forward as we get this city running again.
We're at the verge of the city really reopening. New York City opened their offices. You're hearing a lot of now of the big companies, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, all talking about reopening starting in June and then all the way through Labor Day. But you wonder if that's going to be part of solving the problem. Is the more people we bring, with the feet on the streets, the eyes to see what's happening, the more vibrancy, that itself could help, deal with some of the criminal activity that existed in basically streets that have been barren.
Absolutely. Listen, you're seeing things as a typical person walking the streets now that may have been there in the past, you just never saw, because there were literally hundreds of people walking by in that streets and you felt more comfortable. One individual standing on a corner that may be homeless, that may scare you right now, but when you're walking by him with 100 others, all of a sudden it doesn't bother you as much. So this is what we need. We need people back in our subway system. I think they hit 2.1 million, which is great. It's starting to come back. As city employees are back, we should start seeing them riding the subways. As all these other companies start coming in, there's a huge commitment from the PD to put resources within the subway system. So people, especially during rush hours, so as they're getting onto that train for the first time in a year, they're seeing a police officer. They're getting that comfort level to ride that train. When they're riding the train, they're going to see a police officer on it. When they get off that train, they'll see another police officer. It's important that we're all on the same page and we're all talking the same story here, that New York is coming back. It is safe. I can read all sorts of transit numbers, but if people are scared, if they're seeing things that make them feel scared, it's important that we're doing what we need to do as a city to make them feel safe.
Yeah, and I think this is a responsibility not just of the NYPD and all the social services groups that are involved. It's an obligation. I think a civic obligation for all of us New Yorkers to say, we got to be back. The vaccinations are there. Get vaccinated. Come back. Support your local restaurant. Support your local store. Be on the streets. Ride the subway. That's how you build this vibrancy back. It's like pushing a flywheel. And the more of us that are out there pushing, the more momentum we're going to have, and the sooner that energy and that community of New York that both of us love will come back, and we'll have it there. So that's I feel like we're on the precipice, and your comments are encouraging me along that front. I want one final question for you that we've been asking all of our guests, which is we have the mayoral race coming up in June. We're going to have a new mayor in New York. You obviously have a tremendous amount of experience and insights about how do we ensure public safety for our city, what policies have worked, what haven't worked, what reforms are needed, really to be in a situation that, people feel safe in New York. They feel safe that they're not going to be harmed by strangers, by people that are mentally ill, frankly, by, rogue police, right? That everyone feels that they can come here and have that sense of public safety in New York. So the mayor calls you in and says, what are the, 2 or 3 most important things I should focus on? What would your recommendations be?
One, you have to work with businesses here. New York doesn't grow if business doesn't grow. It's the economic engine. What does business need to do to feel safe in this city, to grow, to prosper? How do we attract new business into the city? Because every social thing that we're going to do in the city is going to get paid for by the taxes that come out of businesses. 2, you got to support your police. If they're a rogue police, we'll get rid of them. And we'll make sure that policing is done in the way it should. But any cop, all they want to do is feel some sort of love from the elected officials. When you turn on the TV, and that's how cops get a lot of what they see, and everyone's going on saying how bad the police are, oh my God, we need to change the police. We need to change the police. And that same cop who may have saved a kid's life that day is watching this and saying how bad they are because of an incident that may have happened somewhere in this country. It's important that they also stand up and celebrate the good things that the cops do each and every day, and just be a positive attitude. We have to work. There's got to be unity in what we do. It can't be politicians fighting against other politicians. I don't care, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. If we all want New York, we all got to join together. And there's got to be some sort of consensus that we can get everyone on the same page here and just move it together for the city I love, for the city you love, for the city that 8.3 million New Yorkers love. It's time we all join together and talk in one voice to move the city along.
Amen to that. You can't, I would just say, you can't, there's no way that you're going to have the city have prosperity without public safety. And we're not going to have public safety without an NYPD that is respected by the people that live in the city and respect the people that live in the city. So I thank you, Chief, for all that you've done, and your brethren for all that they do to protect our city. And I look forward to working with you and your colleagues as we recalibrate reality for a brighter and more sustainable, more equitable New York. So thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, Scott.
Thanks. Have a great day and be safe.
You too. Take care.
That concludes this week's episode of Recalibrate Reality. Make no mistake, we cannot have prosperity without public safety. And public safety means that whether it's walking our city streets, riding the train, or sitting on a stoop, no one should fear being assaulted by a criminal or a rogue police officer. Thank you to Chief Monahan for his service. Thank you to the men and women of the NYPD for putting their lives on the line every day to keep us safe. And thank you to the Regional Plan Association and the 92nd Street Y. And finally, thank you to the team for making this week's episode possible. From 75 Rockefeller Plaza in New York, I'm Scott Rechler. See you next week.